The ballroom was alive with color and sound, every detail polished to perfection. Crystal chandeliers scattered light like fragments of stars, and the grand orchestra filled the space with sweeping notes that made the guests sway as they laughed and danced. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved smoothly between the tables, balancing trays of champagne and delicacies, their presence barely noticed by the glittering crowd. Yet, tucked away in the far corner, there sat a young woman in a wheelchair, her presence quiet against the backdrop of luxury. She wore a flowing pastel gown that shimmered under the lights, her hair styled so elegantly it framed her face like art. From a distance, she looked like she belonged to the grandeur, but the loneliness in her eyes told another story. One after another, men approached the women around her, asking for dances, offering compliments, creating ripples of laughter that never reached her table. Her smile was practiced, polite, but brittle. She sipped at her untouched glass of champagne, tracing her finger over its rim, pretending she didn't notice the way people's eyes slid past her or the whispered comments that carried the sting of pity. Her father, the CEO, mingled with important partners across the room, shaking hands, securing deals, proudly introducing himself to everyone, but never once bringing anyone to her side. She was used to it. Years of being overlooked, of being reduced to her chair rather than her heart, had built a quiet armor around her. Still, tonight under the glittering chandeliers, surrounded by joy she could not touch, the weight of being invisible pressed heavier than ever. At the edge of the glittering room stood a man who looked slightly out of place among the tailored tuxedos and diamond cuffs. His suit was neat but modest, one he probably wore to business meetings and family gatherings alike. He wasn't scanning the crowd for power or status, instead, his gaze had softened on the young woman in the corner, the one no one else seemed to notice. The way her hands rested tensely on the wheels of her chair, the faint sadness in her expression, it struck something deep in him. He thought of his own little girl back home, how her face fell whenever she felt left out at school, how he always told her she deserved to be seen. That same protective instinct now rose in his chest, urging him to move. Taking a steady breath, he crossed the polished floor, ignoring the curious stares from a few guests who wondered why he wasn't networking like the rest. He stopped at her table, and for the first time all evening, she lifted her eyes, startled that someone was standing in front of her. She expected a fleeting smile or maybe a pity-filled remark before he moved on, like so many before him. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his expression warm and sincere, and said with a quiet strength, "Can I be your date tonight?" Her lips parted in disbelief, her heart skipping. For a second, she searched his face for mockery, for insincerity, but all she saw was genuine kindness. No hesitation, no pity, just a man asking her, as if she were the only woman in the room worth noticing. A nervous laugh slipped out of her, caught between surprise and hope, but the sincerity in his eyes anchored her. She realized he meant every word. For the first time that night, she felt seen, completely, undeniably seen. Her laughter lingered in the air, soft but real, and it drew him closer in a way no glittering chandelier or polished speech ever could. He pulled out the chair beside her, sitting down as though this was the most natural place in the entire ballroom. His presence was different. He didn't rush, didn't glance over his shoulder at others, didn't treat her like a fragile ornament. Instead, he began to talk, his voice steady and warm, telling her little stories about his life, about being a single dad. He described the chaos of breakfast mornings, the struggle of packing a school lunch while trying not to burn toast, and the way his daughter always insisted on mismatched socks just to annoy him. She laughed until her shoulders shook, the sound so genuine that heads began to turn. It had been so long since she had laughed like that, so long since she had felt a connection that wasn't shadowed by pity. The music shifted into a slower rhythm, violins sweeping across the hall in a melody that carried both tenderness and longing. Couples began to pair off, the dance floor filling with graceful movements and whispers. For a moment, she glanced down at her wheelchair, her heart sinking at the familiar ache of being excluded. But before the weight could settle, he rose from his chair and extended his hand toward her. The gesture was bold, simple, and breathtaking. Her eyes widened, disbelief flashing across her face. "I can't," she began, her voice trembling with the fear of being embarrassed. But he crouched down slightly, meeting her at eye level, his hand still steady and waiting. "We'll dance our way," he said gently, his smile unwavering. Something inside her cracked open at those words, the barrier of years, the invisible wall built by rejection and silence. Slowly, almost as if afraid it would vanish, she placed her hand in his. With careful grace, he guided her onto the dance floor, moving with her chair in rhythm to the music. Step by step, turn by turn, he matched her pace as though the wheelchair wasn't a limitation but simply part of their dance. Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers following their every movement, but for once she didn't feel the sting of judgment. Instead, she felt weightless, free, radiant under the gaze of a man who saw her as more than what the world chose to notice. For the first time in years, she wasn't invisible. She was a woman being asked to dance, and she was beautiful. The final notes of the orchestra lingered like a promise in the air, and when the song ended, neither of them moved right away. She was flushed, her cheeks glowing brighter than the chandeliers above, and he still held her hand as though letting go would break the fragile magic they had created. Slowly, he guided her back toward the edge of the dance floor, but this time the room no longer felt suffocating. People weren't ignoring her anymore, they were watching with wide eyes, admiration replacing indifference. For once, she wasn't the overlooked daughter of the CEO. She was the woman who had stolen the spotlight with nothing but her laughter and courage, framed by the steady presence of the man beside her. When the evening drew to a close, he offered to wheel her outside, away from the crowded ballroom and into the soft quiet of the night. The city stretched out before them, glowing with golden lights that shimmered against the dark sky. The cool breeze brushed against her skin, lifting strands of her hair, and she looked at him, her heart beating harder than it had in years. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile as she said, "No one has ever treated me like this before." He stopped, turning so she could see the sincerity in his eyes. He reached down, gently taking her hand, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin. "That's their loss," he replied, his voice steady, grounded. "You deserve every dance, every smile, every single moment. Don't ever forget that." For a long moment, she couldn't find words. Her chest tightened with emotions she had buried for so long: hope, belonging, the thrilling spark of being wanted not out of duty but out of choice. She smiled then, soft but radiant, and the loneliness that had haunted her seemed to loosen its grip. The night no longer felt heavy, it felt like a beginning. As their eyes lingered on one another, she realized that the simple question he had asked, "Can I be your date?" had changed everything. It wasn't just a dance, or a fleeting kindness. It was the spark of something she had almost stopped believing in. The chance to be loved, fully and fiercely, for who she was. And for the first time in years, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, love had finally found her.